Step 2, skill acquisition, the practice mode. At some point, as you progress through these initial months of observation, you will enter the most critical part of your apprenticeship, practice towards the acquisition of skills. Every human activity, endeavor, or career path involves the mastering of skills. In some fields, it is direct and obvious, like operating a tool or machine or creating something physical. In others, it is more of a mix of the physical and mental, such as observing and collecting of specimens for Charles Darwin. In still others, the skills are more nebulous, such as handling people or researching and organizing information. As much as possible, you want to reduce these skills to something simple and essential, the core of what you need to get good at, skills that can be practiced. In acquiring skills, in acquiring any kind of skill, there exists a natural learning process that coincides with functioning of our brains. This learning process leads to what we shall call tacit knowledge, a feeling for what you are doing that is hard to put into words but easy to demonstrate in action. And to understand how this learning process operates, it is useful to look at the greatest system ever invented for training of skills and the achievement of tacit knowledge, the apprenticeship system of the Middle Ages. This system arose as a solution to a problem. As business expanded in the Middle Ages, masters of various crafts could no longer depend on family members to work in just shop. They needed more hands, but it was not worth it for them to bring in people who would come and go. They needed stability and time to build up skills in their workers, and so they developed the apprenticeship system in which young people from approximately the ages of 12 to 17 would enter work in a shop, signing a contract that would commit them for a term of 7 years. At the end of this term, apprentice would have to pass a master test or produce a master work to prove their level of skill. Once passed, they were now elevated to the rank of journeyman and could travel wherever there was work, practicing the craft. Because few books or drawings existed at the time, apprentices would learn the trade by watching masters and imitating them as closely as possible. They learned through endless repetition and hands on work with very little verbal instruction. Because resources such as textiles, food, and metals were expensive and could not be wasted on practice runs. Apprentices would spend most of their time working directly on materials that would be used for final product. They had to learn how to focus deeply on their work and not make mistakes. If one added up the time that apprentices ended up working directly on materials in those years, it would amount to more than 10,000 hours, enough to establish exceptional skill level at that craft. The power of this form of tacit knowledge is embodied in the great Gothic cathedrals of Europe, masterpieces of beauty, craftsmanship, and stability, all erected without blueprints or books. These cathedrals represented the accumulated skills of numerous craftsmen and engineers. What this means is simple. Language, oral and written, is a relatively recent invention. Well before that time, our ancestors had to learn various skills, tool making, hunting, and so forth. The natural model for learning, largely based on the power of mirror neurons, came from watching and imitating others and repeating the action over and over. Our brains are highly suited for this form of learning. In an activity such as riding a bicycle, we all know that it is easier to watch someone and follow their lead than to listen or to read instructions. The more we do it, the easier it becomes. Even with skills that are primarily mental, such as computer programming or speaking a foreign language, it remains the case that we learn best through practice and repetition, the natural learning process. We learn a foreign language by actually speaking it as much as possible, not by reading books and absorbing theories. The more we speak and practice, the more fluent we become. Once you take this far enough, you enter a cycle of accelerated returns in which the practice becomes easier and more interesting, leading to the ability to practice for longer hours, which increases your skill level, which in turn makes practice even more interesting. Reaching this cycle is the goal you must set for yourself, and to get there, you must understand some basic principles about skills themselves. First, it is essential that you begin with one skill that you can master and that serves as a foundation for acquiring others. You must avoid at all costs the idea that you can manage learning several skills at a time. You need to develop your powers of concentration and understand that trying to multitask will be the death of the process. Second, the initial stages of learning a skill invariably involve tedium, yet rather then avoiding this inevitable tedium, you must accept and embrace it. The path and boredom we experience in the initial stage of learning a skill toughens our minds much like a physical exercise. Too many people believe that everything must be pleasurable in life, which makes them constantly search for distractions and short circuits the learning processes. The pain is a kind of challenge your mind presents. Will you learn how to focus and move past the boredom, or like a child, will you succumb to the need for immediate pleasure and destruction? Much as with physical exercise, you can even get kind of perverse pleasure out of this pain, knowing the benefits it will bring you. In any event, you must meet any boredom head on and not try to avoid or repress it. Throughout your life, you will encounter tedious situations and you must cultivate the ability to handle them with discipline. In practicing a skill in the initial stages, something happens neurologically to the brain that is important for you to understand. When you start something new, a large number of neurons in frontal cortex, the higher and more conscious command area of the brain, are recruited and become active, helping you in the learning process. The brain has to deal with large amount of new information, and this would be stressful and overwhelming if only a limited part of the brain were used to handle it. The frontal cortex even expands in size in this initial phase as we focus hard on the task. But once something is repeated often enough, it becomes hardwired and automatic, and the neural pathways for this skill are delegated to other parts of the brain further down the cortex. Those neurons in frontal cortex that we needed in the initial stages are now freed up to help in learning something else, and the area goes back to its normal size. In the end, an entire network of neurons is developed to remember this single task, which accounts for the fact that we can still ride a bicycle years after we first learn how to do so. If we were to take a look at the frontal cortex of those who have mastered something through repetition, it would be remarkably still and inactive as they perform the skill, all of their brain activities occurring in areas that are lower down and require much less conscious control. The process of hardwiring cannot occur if you are constantly distracted, moving from one task to another. In such a case, the neural pathways dedicated to the skill never get established. What you learn is too tenuous to remain rooted in the brain. It is better to dedicate 2 or 3 hours of intense focus to a skill than to spend 8 hours of diffused concentration on it. You want to be as immediately present to what you are doing as possible. Once an actions become automatic, you now have the mental space to observe yourself as you practice. You must use this distance to take note of your weaknesses or flaws that needs correction, to analyze yourself. It helps also to gain as much feedback as possible from others, to have standards against which you can measure your progress so that you are aware of how far you have to go. People who do not practice and learn new skills never gain a proper sense of proportion and self criticism. They think they can achieve anything without effort and have little contact with reality. Trying something over and over again grounds you in reality, making you deeply aware of your inadequacies and of what you can accomplish with more work and effort. If you take this far enough, you will naturally enter the cycle of accelerated returns. As you learn and gain skills, you can begin to vary what you do, finding nuances that you can develop in the work so that it becomes more interesting. Elements become more automatic, your mind is not exhausted by the effort, and you can practice harder, which in turn brings greater skill and more pleasure. You can look for challenges, new areas to conquer, keeping your interest at high level. As the cycle accelerates, you can reach a point where your mind is totally absorbed in the practice, entering a kind of flow in which everything else is blocked out. You become one with the tool or instrument or thing you are studying. Your skill is not something that can be put into words, it is embedded in your body and nervous system. It becomes stacked knowledge. Learning any kind of skill deeply prepares you for mastery. The sensation of flow and of being a part of the instrument is the precursor to the great pleasures that mastery can bring. In essence, when you practice and develop any skill, you transform yourself in the process. You reveal to yourself new capabilities that were previously latent, that are exposed as you progress. You develop emotionally. Your sense of pleasure becomes redefined. What offers immediate pleasure comes to seem like a distraction and empty entertainment to help pass the time. Real pleasure comes from overwhelming challenges, feeling confidence in your abilities, gaining fluency in skills, and experiencing the power this brings. You develop patience. Boredom no longer signals the need for distraction, but rather the need for new challenges to conquer. Although it might seem that the time necessary to master the requisite skills and attain a level of expertise would depend on the field and your own talent level, those who have researched the subject repeatedly come up with a number of 10,000 hours. This seems to be the amount of quality practice time that is needed for someone to reach a high level of skill, and it applies to composers, chess players, writers, and athletes, among others. This number has an almost magical or mystical resonance to it. It means that so much practice time, no matter the person or the field, leads to a qualitative change in the human brain. The mind has learned to organize and structure large amounts of information. With all of this stacked knowledge, it can now become creative and playful with it. Although the number of hours might seem high, it generally adds up to 7 to 10 years of sustained, solid practice, roughly the period of traditional apprenticeship. In other words, concentrated practice over time cannot fail but produce results.